Over in my presentation here, I currently have two slides that I've created. If I would like to update, let's say, the background color of one, I have the ability to do that. I can also add things like text, I can add shapes, I can also annotate and draw on this particular slide if I would like. I can also choose to resize particular elements within my canvas. And then of course I can also copy and paste different elements around as well. And finally, if I was to save any changes to my particular presentation here, those changes would be updated within my database and then reflected within our slide preview card here. Hello, my name is Lachlan Kirkwood, and today I'll be teaching you how to build a Google Slides clone entirely out of no code using Bubble. Unlike most of my clone build tutorials, this complete guide is going to be free. So just after watching this video, you'll have a complete MVP that you can get in the hands of your customers or that you can use internally yourself. And throughout this tutorial today, we'll be making use of the Fabric.JS plugin, which is created by Techblocks. This plugin allows you to create a slide canvas within your Bubble editor that users can draw on or add shapes to in order to bring their presentations to life. And so within this full tutorial, I'm going to be walking you through how we can create each of those features, as well as some other essential features like being able to copy and paste elements on a slide canvas, update things like the background color, add your own images to that slide, and even save and download those slides as a PNG file. Look, there's so much that I want to cover throughout today's build, so let's just grab our Bubble editor and we can get right to it. Within my build today, the first thing I'd like to do is actually just take the time to set up and structure my database, which will just allow me to build all of the other features I'll need throughout this tutorial. And now, for the sake of our tutorial today, I've just created a Notion doc that lists out all of the different features as well as all of the different steps we'll need to follow in order to bring our Google Slides product to life. And what I love about Notion is that it just allows you to create a checklist where you can tick off items as you finish adding them into your Bubble editor. And of course, I'll be sure to share a link to this Notion doc so you can create a duplicate of this template if you'd like. But as you'll see, the first thing I want to cover today is just, first of all, building out the database to power our Google Slides application. And then we're going to create a home page where users can create a new presentation within our application. So we're going to start by building out the structure for our database, and I've got a brand new Bubble editor opened here. What we'll do is we'll head over to our data tab here. And when it comes to building out the database for our Google Slides product, it's actually a pretty straightforward process. There's not too many data types or fields that we'll need to actually add. Essentially, there's only two data types I would like to create. The first is going to be called a presentation. So whenever a user would like to create a brand new presentation, they're going to create a new entry within our database. And the only information I'll be storing for each presentation is just the name of it. So this is the title essentially that someone's going to give their presentation. So I'm going to add an additional data field here, and we're going to call this the name field, and I'll set this field type to be a text entry. I'll choose to create that. And that's actually all we'll need to create for our presentation data type. The only other data type we'll need to add is a slide. So within every single presentation, there's going to be a list of slides that belong to it. And of course, a user can add as many different slides as they would like into an overall presentation. And it's on the slide data type that we're going to be adding majority of the data fields we'll be working with today. And of course, we'll need to link our individual slides back to an overarching presentation. And so when it comes to the data fields under our slide data type, I'm going to start by creating a new field. And as I mentioned, I'm going to first want to link each individual slide back to an overarching presentation. So I'm going to create a data field called original presentation. And this is the presentation that this slide should belong to. So I'm going to call this field OG presentation. And I'm going to set this field type to be a presentation data type. so that way it can link back to one presentation. And then when it comes to the remaining data fields, we're just going to need to add a list of all the customizations that we can make once I've added in my overall Google Slides canvas. And so this is things like being able to store a background image on the slide as well as a background color. And then of course create a preview image, which we can choose to save when a user downloads each slide. So I'm going to start by creating a new data field here, and I'll be calling this background color. And this is just going to be a text field type, just because I'll be storing a color code within this field. And that will allow us to, of course, store a background color on an individual slide. But I'd also like to allow users to store a background image. So I'm going to create another field here, and I'll be calling this one background image. Only, of course, this time the field type for this data field is going to, of course, be an image. I'll choose to create that. And then from here, I'd like to create what's called a slide image. And now this is going to be the preview image of a slide that will be saved when a user chooses to download the actual slide itself. And so this field type will yet again be another image. And then finally, the very last thing I'm going to need to create is what's called a serialization. And now the serialization is almost just like a unique ID that we can link back to our slide canvas once we add that element onto our page. And it'll allow us to essentially just save all of the contents within a particular slide through a serialization number. And then if we'd like to, let's say, display that slide on a page, we can reference the particular serialization number we'd like to display at any given time. And now when it comes to the serialization field, this is just going to be a text field type. I will choose to create that. And that's all of the data types and fields we'll need to add into our database here. So I'm just going to jump back into my Notion doc and check off that we have finished building out the database for our Google Slides clone today. And from here, what I'd like to do is build out a home page within our application that just allows a user to start by creating a new presentation, which will of course then redirect them through to a dedicated page where they can start building out these slides within that presentation. And so what I'm going to do is jump back over into my bubble editor here, and I'm going to create a brand new page within my application. I'm going to head to my page drop down menu here. I'm going to choose to add a new page, and I'll be calling this the home page of my application. I'll choose to create this. And then on this page, the first thing I'd like to do is just open up my element inspector. And currently at the time of recording this tutorial, the Flexbox responsive engine is still not yet the default option. So I'm just going to need to choose to upgrade my responsive engine here to become the CSS Flexbox version. So I'm going to upgrade my responsive engine. And once my page has been updated to the new responsive engine, I'm also just going to choose to update the background color of my page just to be a light shade of gray for the time being. And the reason I'm doing that is so it allows me to see where the dimensions of my page sit within my bubble canvas. And then when it comes to this overall page itself, I'm going to jump over to my layout tab and set the container layout of this page to be a column type, because I'd like to build my page from top to bottom, which means I want to stack elements on this page vertically. For this particular page, I'm going to keep the UI builder at 960 pixels. Although, of course, I'm going to show you how we can make our page fully responsive, so that way, regardless of the user's device, this page is going to scale accordingly. And then the first element I'd like to add onto my page is just a title, followed by an icon element that will be used as a button to create a new presentation. And because I want these two elements to be placed horizontally beside each other, I'm going to need to add in a container group on my page, which just has the container layout of a row. So I'm going to scroll on down to my containers menu here. I'm going to choose to add in a group element. I'm going to jump over to my appearance tab, remove the style of this group, and just set the background style to be a flat color. And the reason I'm doing this is because I'm going to upgrade the color of this to be a light shade of red, just so I can actually see where this group sits on my page. Of course, when you preview and publish your application, you can remove this color, but for the time being, I just think it's best practice to actually be able to visually see where you're adding groups onto the page. I'm then going to jump over to my layout tab within this group, because I'm going to set the container layout to be a row. And the reason I'm doing that, as I mentioned, is because I want to place two elements side by side. I'm then going to unselect that this element is fixed width, and I'm going to set the minimum width of this to be 0 and the maximum width to be infinite, which if I jump over into my responsive engine, as you'll see, this now makes this group infinitely scalable regardless of the size of the page, which is the exact experience we want to create. And of course, I will be updating the height of this group, but I'm just going to start by adding in the elements I'd like to display within this group. So I'm going to start by adding in a text element here, and this is just going to display the word presentations. I'm going to also update the style of this to just be the default H2 dark style heading that Bubble provides. And then I'm going to jump over into my layout tab here. I'm going to unselect that this element is fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, the maximum width to be infinite, so that way, once again, this text element is now going to be fully responsive. I'll also set the minimum height here to be 0, and what that'll ensure is that the actual element itself will now sit nicely around the text within it. And now beside this text element, I'd just like to add in an icon that'll be used as a button. So I'm going to head to my visual elements once again. I'll select to add in an icon element. And when it comes to this icon, I'm just going to search for a plus icon here. I'm going to select this square plus icon. I'll jump over into my layout tab. And for this icon, I actually want this to be fixed width. So essentially, I want it to remain the same size at all times. I don't want it to get larger or smaller if the page scales up or down. So what I am going to do though is just update the width of this icon to be 30 pixels and the height of this icon to also be 30 pixels. And I'm going to want to ensure that this icon is always vertically aligned in the center of my red group. And I'll need to do the same for my text element here as well. I'll vertically align that in the center of my group. And then from here, what I can do is open up my overall red group, and I can reduce the minimum height of this group to now be 0. And because we've selected this option here to fit the height of this group around the elements that sit within it, it's going to collapse accordingly and fit around all the elements that, as I mentioned, lie within it. And now that's how we can add two elements side by side on our page. But there's just a few minor tweaks that I want to make here. The first is that I want to bring this group down on my page just so there's some spacing on the top of my page. So I'm going to scroll on down to my margin settings here, and for the top margin I'm just going to add 40 pixels of margin. And then what I'm also going to do is add 20 pixels of margin on the left and 20 pixels of margin on the right. And that'll now just ensure that the edges of my red group do not touch the borders of my page. So now you can see that the text element here is positioned nicely to the left, but is not on the border of my page. The only other thing I'd like to do is just update the responsive settings for my presentations text here. So because this element currently has a maximum infinite width, it's allowed to scale across the full width of our red group, which obviously means it's putting quite a bit of space between the text and the icon element, whereas I'd like the icon to be placed right next to the text. What I can do in this case is just choose to actually add a maximum width. I could say this should be, let's say, 150 pixels. And now what you'll see is that the text element itself will collapse, and then the gap between that text and the icon element will collapse. And now that just creates the exact experience I had in mind. But from here, what I'd like to do is now build out a workflow that allows a user to create a new presentation every single time they click on our plus icon here. And the way I'll be doing that is by using what's called a pop-up element. And pop-ups are just a great way to get a user input or show some information to a user without having to redirect them through to a separate page. It just displays over the top of the current page that the user is viewing. And so if I scroll on down to my containers menu, I'm going to choose to add in a pop-up element on my page here. I'm going to call this pop-up create presentation. And I'm going to set the container layout of this pop-up to be a column, because once again, I'll be stacking items from top to bottom on it. And when it comes to the actual elements I'm going to be adding onto this pop-up, this is pretty straightforward. I'm just going to add a text element at the top here. And this is just going to display the text presentation title. I'd like to make this text bold, so I'm going to open up my rich text editor here. I'm going to highlight all of this text and choose to bold the formatting of it. I'll then choose to save that. I'd then like to jump over into my layout tab because I'll need to make this text element fully responsive. So I'm going to unselect that this element should be fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, the maximum width to be infinite, so that way it's going to scale across whatever space it's allocated on our pop-up. I'll also set the minimum height here to be 0, because of course we have this option selected here, which just means the element's going to fit to the height of the content within it. But what I'd also like to do is just add some margins to this text element. So I'm going to add 20 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the left, and 20 on the right. And now that's going to just position that in a better spot within my pop-up. Below this, I'd then like to add in an input element. So this is where a user can actually add in the presentation title. And so I'm going to add this element in. I'm going to update the name of this to be called input presentation title. And then of course, I'm going to need to update the design settings of this element. So I'm going to head to my layout tab once again. I'm going to, like my text element before, unselect that this element should be fixed width. Set the minimum width to be 0. And then when it comes to the height, I do want to keep this fixed width because I want this to be 45 pixels of height at all given times. I don't want this to get larger or smaller. So I'm not going to change any of the height settings. The only thing I will do is just add 10 pixels of margin at the top of this element. And of course 20 pixels of margin on the left and 20 on the right. So that way it's in line with the element that's sat above it there. And then finally, I just like to add a button that's going to trigger a workflow, which of course will create a new presentation within our database. So I'm going to scroll on up to our visual elements. I'll select to add in a button element. I'm just going to have this display the word create. And I'm going to jump to my layout tab here. And I'm going to keep all the dimensions of this element fixed width because I'm happy with the button always being this size. The only changes I'd like to make is just first of all updating the horizontal alignment of this element. I want this to be positioned within the center of my pop-up. And then of course I'm just going to need to add in some margins for this element. So I'm going to add 20 pixels of margin at the top and also just 20 pixels at the bottom. I obviously won't need to worry about adding in any margins on the left and right hand side, just because this element is centered far from the borders of my actual pop-up. And from here, I'll just need to close off all of this empty space at the bottom of my pop-up. So I'm going to click on the pop-up itself. I'm going to set the minimum height to be 0. And because we've selected the fit height to content option, it's going to just collapse the remaining height there. And of course from here, now what I'd like to do is actually create a brand new presentation within my database every single time this button is clicked. So I'm going to select my button here. I'm going to choose to start edit a workflow. And within this workflow, I'm going to head to my data tab here. I'm going to choose to create a new thing within my database. The thing I would like to create is going to be a presentation. And for the field type that I'd like to register, because I only have one field, I'm just obviously going to select that, which is the name of the presentation. This is going to equal the same value as the input on our pop-up. So I'm going to select its value. And then from here, once a presentation has been created, I'd like to redirect a user through to a page where they can start actually editing that presentation. So I'm going to choose to add an additional step within my workflow. I'm going to head to my navigation action here and select the go to page option. The destination page at this point does not yet exist. So I'm going to need to scroll on down and choose to create a new page. And I'm going to be calling this page my presentation page. I will choose to create this. And before I select the destination page to be the new page I've created, I'm going to need to set a type of content on that destination page, just because I'd like to send through the data of the new presentation that we've just created. So if I head to my page drop-down menu here, I'm going to jump on over to my presentation page. And on this page, I'm going to update the type of content to be a presentation. So now this page knows that it needs to display the information of a presentation. I'm then going to jump back into my home page, open up my workflow editor and select the workflow that I had just created. And I'll set the destination page to be our presentation page. And the data I'll be sending through to it is, of course, the result of step 1 in our workflow, where we had, in fact, just created a new presentation. And that's how we can build out the workflow to create a presentation. What I'd also like to do is just create a workflow to obviously display our pop-up on this page. And the way I can do that is by selecting my icon element here. I'm going to choose to start a workflow every single time this icon is clicked. And I'm going to want to show my pop-up that we've added. So in order to do that, I'm going to scroll on down to my element actions here. I'm going to choose to show an element. And the element will, of course, be our pop-up create presentation. Finally, the very last thing I'd like to add onto this page is just a list of all of the presentations that we have created within our account here. And the way I can do that is by adding a repeating group onto my page, which, if you're relatively new to Bubble, repeating groups are a way to display a list of things within your database. So think of if you were to create something like an Instagram homepage. If you wanted to display a list of all of the posts that have been published within your application, you'd use a repeating group to do that. And in a similar sense, today we're going to use a repeating group to display a list of all of the presentations that have been created within a user's account. So I'm going to scroll on down to my containers menu here. I'm going to choose to add a repeating group onto my page. And what you'll see now is that this just looks like a list of cells. We're going to be updating the layout of this in a moment. But the first thing I'd like to do is set the type of content for my repeating group, just so it knows what data to display from my database. So for the type of content, I'd like to display a list of presentations. And when it comes to the presentations I'd like to pull from my database, I'm just going to perform a search through essentially all of the presentations in my database. So I'm just assuming in my application here that we're building for one particular user, and they'll just want to view all of their presentations that they've created. So I'm going to just choose to leave this search as that. I'll close that there. And then when it comes to the actual layout of our repeating group, I'm going to start by jumping over to the layout tab here. And I'm going to, first of all, unselect that this element should be fixed width. Of course, because I'd like it to scale across my page. I'm also going to set the minimum width to be 0. And I'll be coming back later to update the minimum height once I've finished adding some elements into it. I'm also going to update the container layout style to be a column, because within my repeating group, I'm just going to be stacking items from top to bottom. I'm then going to jump over to my appearance tab, and I'm just going to update the number of rows and columns that this repeating group displays. So I'm going to unselect both of these options, and what you'll now see is that it creates a grid of different cells within our repeating group. And when it comes to configuring the layout of a repeating group within the new responsive engine, I personally find that you just need to tinker around a bit with the particular dimensions that you would like to add for your repeating group. And of course, you can change these at any given time. For the minimum height of each row, I'm just going to start by setting this at, let's say, 300 pixels, which is probably a little too big, but as I mentioned, we can come back and change that later. And then for the minimum width, I'm also going to set this as 300 pixels. And what you'll now see is that each of the repeating group cells has expanded. Before I start adding in some content into my repeating group though, what I'd like to do is just head to the style of this repeating group, and I'd like to remove the style. Because if I scroll on down to the border style, I'm just going to set this to be a solid color. And what that essentially does is it just allows me to see where this repeating group sits on my page if I was to click away from it. I'm also going to open up my repeating group again, and I'm going to head to my layout tab here, just because I'd like to add some margins around this repeating group. I'm going to add 20 pixels of margin around every single border here, and that'll just ensure that, similar to the previous elements I've added onto this page, it does not touch the borders of the actual page canvas. And now from here, I can start adding in the elements I'd like to display within each cell of my repeating group. And this is actually going to be a pretty straightforward process, because I'm only going to want to add in an image as well as a text element. So I'm going to head to my visual elements. I'm going to select to add in an image element here. And for this image, I'm just going to display the preview image of the very first slide that has been created within this presentation. So I'm going to insert dynamic data, and I'm going to perform a search through my database for all of these slides where the original presentation that they belong to equals the same value as the current cells presentation within my repeating group. And I'm going to display the first item, so the very first slide that's being displayed in this presentation. I'm going to display its slide image, which is like the thumbnail image for that slide. I'm then going to select the More option, and I'm going to select that I want to process this with Imgix, just because I want to tick this option here to resize the dimensions by cropping them. And then of course, I'll just need to update the responsive settings of this image. Before I do that though, I'm going to head to my border, and I'm going to once again add a solid border around this image so I can see where it actually sits within my repeating group. I'm then going to jump to my layout tab here. I'm going to unselect that this element should be fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, the maximum width to be infinite. And then when it comes to the height of this image, I'm not going to set the minimum to be 0. Instead, I'm going to want this to be a minimum height of 200 pixels. I'm also then going to add in some margins around this image. I'm just going to choose to add in 10 pixels of margin on the top, 10 on the left, and 10 on the right. And that'll just ensure that it doesn't touch the borders of my repeating group. And then finally, the last element I'd like to add in within this repeating group is just a text element. And this is just going to display the name of the presentation. So I'm just going to choose to insert dynamic data and display the current cell's presentation, its name, and then I'd like to bold the formatting of this text. So I'm going to open up my rich text editor, highlight this text, choose to bold that. And then finally, I'll just need to configure the responsive settings of this text element. So I'm going to head over to my layout tab here. I'm going to unselect that this element is fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, the maximum width to be infinite, the minimum height to also be 0 because I want it to collapse around my text. And then for the margins, I'm just going to add 10 pixels of margin around every single border, just so that way it's in line with the image above it. And then finally, the very last thing I'll need to do is just close off all of the empty space within my repeating group here. So I'm going to open up my repeating group, and under my layout tab, I'm going to set the minimum height to be 0. I'm also then going to jump over to my appearance tab here, and I'm going to set the minimum height of each row to be 0. And what you'll now see is that it will collapse the height accordingly. I will leave the minimum width of the column to be 300. But one thing I will note is that although you only see one row of repeating group cells here, this will continually scale down based on how many different presentations you have stored within your database. And finally, there is one very last thing I'd like to do, and that is just create a redirect event to our presentation page whenever someone clicks the image of this slide here. So I'm going to select our slide image. I'm going to choose to start edit a workflow, and I'm going to select from a navigation event, choose the go to page option, and within my destination page, I'd like to set this to be our presentation page. And when it comes to the data I'd like to send through, I'm going to want to send the current cell's presentation. And that's actually all I want to create for our homepage here. So what I'm going to do is jump back into my Notion doc and check off that we've not only finished building out the actual homepage itself, but we've also created the workflow to create a new presentation. And I'm not going to show you a demo of that just right now. Instead, what I'm going to do is show you a demo once we're able to actually start editing the presentation slides themselves. But for now, I know this page wasn't a very exciting feature to have to build, but it's definitely an essential page to power the rest of our Google Slides application. Now that we've finished building out the workflows and page necessary to create a new presentation, what I want to do is get to the, core of my tutorial today, and that is explaining how we can start creating new slides within a presentation. And of course, after we've learned how to do that, we can start focusing on all of the different customization settings that you can add to a slide So things like being able to add text or shapes or even drawings to it. But the main thing I want to focus on right now is just the workflows needed in order to actually create and display a slide within our bubble editor. And there's a little bit that's involved within this particular process. So I'll be sure to explain everything in as much detail as possible. But for the time being, we're just going to jump back over into our bubble application here. And then we're going to open up our presentation page that we had previously created. Now at this point in our tutorial, this page should be blank. The only change I've made to this page is that I've updated the type of content to be a presentation, because I'll be sending data through of a new presentation that's been created on our home page. And I've also just gone ahead and I've updated this page to be the new Flexbox responsive engine, because of course I'll be showing you how we can make this page fully responsive today. What I'd like to do from here though is just update the background color to once again just be a light shade of gray, just so I can see where it sits on my overall canvas. I'm also going to jump to my layout tab and I'm going to set the container layout of this page to be a column. And then I'd like the UI builder width here to be 1260, because that's just going to give us some additional space to work with. Of course, as we add elements onto the page, they are going to be fully responsive. And while I'm here updating the layout dimensions of this page, I'm also just going to set the minimum height to be 1500 for now. You can of course come back and change that before you preview or publish your application. And now when it comes to the design of this page, I just have an example of what I'd like to create in a separate bubble editor here. So essentially this is a very rough version, but I want to actually have the slide canvas positioned in the center of my page here. I then want to have a menu at the top of my page, and this is going to display all of the different features you can add to your slide. So if you want to add things like a background image, some text, or even shapes, this is where you can select to add in those options. And then on the left hand side here, I'd like to display a repeating group that shows all of the slides that belong to this particular presentation. And of course, when someone is to click on a slide here, I'd like to update my canvas here to feature that slide. So that way we can choose to make any additional changes we'd like. But this, as I said, is just a general overview of the page that we're going to be creating today. So I'm going to jump back into my bubble editor here that I'm working within. And now in order to create this page, I'm going to start by adding in a couple of different group elements just to structure my menu at the top. So I'm going to scroll on down to my containers menu. I'll select to add in a group. Like always, I'm going to head to my appearance tab and remove the style of that group. I'm going to set the background color to be a flat color. I'm just going to make this a light shade of red, just so we can see where it actually sits on my page. When it comes to the layout of this group, I'm going to set the container layout to be a row, because if you remember seeing, we're going to want to display all of our options horizontally in a group. So I'm going to have that set to be a row. I'm going to jump back into this editor now, and I'm going to unselect that this element should be fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, the maximum width to be infinite. And then of course, I'll be coming back later on to update the minimum height settings. I'll be setting that to 0 as well, but I'll need to add in some elements into this group first. When it comes to the margin though, what I'd like to do is essentially add in some space to display my repeating group on the left hand side, and also just ensure that no element touches the right hand border of my page. So I'm going to jump back into my editor, and when it comes to the margin here, I'm going to set a margin of 30 pixels at the top of this group. On the left hand side, I'm going to add in 300 pixels of margin. And then on the right hand side, I'm just going to add in 20 pixels of margin. And what you'll now see is that this is going to be the structure and position of our group on the page. And now when it comes to the menu options we'll be adding into this group, I'm just going to start with one for now. And that is just going to be our plus icon here. So this is of course how we're going to create a new slide within our application. So I'm going to jump over into my bubble editor here, and within my red group, I'm going to add yet another group. For the appearance of this group, I'm just going to remove the style. I'll set the background style to be a flat color, and I'll have this be white. And then I'm going to update the roundness of the borders of this group to be 10 pixels. I'm then going to jump to my layout tab here, and I will update the container layout of this group to be a column, because within these group elements, I'm going to be stacking items vertically, so from top to bottom. I'm then going to keep this element fixed width and fixed height, because I want it to remain the same consistent size at all given times. And I'm going to set the width of this to be 60 pixels, and then the height of this to also be 60 pixels, and that'll make it a perfect square. And then within this, I'm of course going to add in an icon element. So I'm going to head to my visual elements here. I'll add in an icon, and I'm just going to type in a plus icon. I'll select this option here. And when it comes to the layout settings of this icon, I'm going to want to align this horizontally within my group. I'm going to set the width of this to be 25 pixels, the height of this to be 25 pixels, and then I'm just going to add in a top margin of 20 pixels. And now that icon will be roughly centered within my group there. And then of course, whenever this group is clicked, I'm going to trigger a workflow that's going to create a new slide within our overall presentation. And when a slide is created, I would like to add it to the list of all the slides that are within this presentation on the left-hand side. And so before I build out the workflow to create that slide, I'm just going to add in a repeating group that's going to display a list of all my slides. And because I'd like this repeating group to be displayed on the left-hand side of my page here, I'm going to need to store that within another group element. Only this time, instead of using just a standard group, I'm going to use what's called a floating group. So if you're not familiar, floating groups essentially hover over any elements that are on your page. So while they act like a group, they're not actually positioned on the page around your elements. They're positioned over the top like a pop-up. And the reason I'm using a floating group is because I'm going to position this on the left-hand side of my page here. And while it's going to look like it's on the left-hand side of my page, it's actually hovering over this space here. But because of course we have a margin of 300 pixels here, it'll have plenty of space to sit on our page and create the illusion that it's a part of it. So if I jump to my appearance tab here, I'm going to update the style here. I'm going to remove this. I'm going to set the background style to be a flat color. I'm just going to make this a light shade of blue for the time being. I'm then going to jump to my layout tab here and set the container layout to be a column. For the width of this floating group, I'm going to want this to be 300 pixels because that is how much space of margin I have between my red group here. I'll keep the height at 250 pixels for the time being. But I'm also just going to add a top margin of 30 pixels, so that way it's in line with the red group on my page here. And now within this floating group, I'd like to add a repeating group element. So I'm going to head to my containers menu. I'm going to add in a repeating group here. And within this repeating group, I'd like to display a list of all the slides that have been created within this presentation. So for the type of content, I'm going to set this to be a slide. And then for the data source, I'm going to perform a search through my database for all of the slides where the original presentation that they belong to equals the same value as the current page presentation. I will then choose to close my data source there, and I'm going to now update the layout style of this repeating group. Before I do that, I'm going to remove the default style here, just because I'd like to scroll down to my border and add a solid border around this repeating group, just so I can see where it actually sits within my blue group there. I'm then going to remove that this repeating group should have a fixed number of rows. And then I'm just going to set the minimum height here to be 300 pixels for now. I can of course change that at any given time later on. I will keep the number of columns fixed at 1 though, because I'm only going to want one slide to be displayed on one row of our repeating group. When it comes to the repeating group itself, I'm then going to jump over to my layout tab and update its responsive settings. I'm going to unselect that this repeating group should be fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0. And when it comes to the margin of this repeating group, I'd just like to add in a margin of 10 pixels all the way around this repeating group cell. And then from here, I'm just going to add in one image element into our repeating group. But before I do that, I'll just need to set the container layout of this repeating group to be a column. I'm then going to scroll on up to my visual elements. I'll select to add in an image into my repeating group. And the image I'd like to display is going to be the current cell slide, its slide image, which will just be a saved preview of the slide that's been created. So almost like a thumbnail image for that slide. And now when it comes to the responsive settings for this image, I'm going to head to our layout tab here. And I am going to keep this image fixed width. Only for the width of this image, I'm going to update this to be 280 pixels. And now the reason why I've selected 280 pixels is because the width of our blue group here is 300 pixels. And we'll need to remember that we've added 10 pixels of margin on either side of this repeating group that sits within it. So the width of our repeating group is now also 280 pixels. When it comes to the height, I will also have this be a fixed width, and I'll set the height to be 160 pixels. And then for the margin around this image, I just like to add 10 pixels of margin at the top and 10 at the bottom. And that's just going to ensure that when I collapse the empty height at my repeating group, there's going to be some spaces between each entry that we have displayed. So I'm going to now click on my overall repeating group. I'm going to set the minimum height here to be 0. I'm also going to make sure I've selected this option to fit the height of my repeating group to the content that sits within it. I'll jump over to my appearance tab, and I'm just going to set the minimum height of each row to now be 0. And what you'll see is that my repeating group will collapse and my image is going to sit within that. And of course, our repeating group will continually scale down based on how many slides are being displayed within our overall presentation. And now before we go and build out the workflow to create a new slide, we're going to need to install a plugin which will of course allow us to display and edit a slide. And so if we head over to our plugins tab here, I'd just like to note that I have already installed the plugin, but you'll need to open up your plugin library and search for the Fabric.JS plugin. And so what this plugin does is it allows you to add in a canvas on your page that you can customize. So you can draw on it, you can paint on it, you can add shapes and text to it. And what I love about this plugin is that it has plenty of great documentation as well as a demo editor that you can experiment with. So I've got the demo editor opened over here, and as you can see, this is what the canvas will look like. You can draw on it, you can update the color of the pencil that you would like to draw on it, you can add shapes onto this canvas, and you can even copy and paste elements if you would like. But this is where you'll start to see the actual functionality of the Google Slides product come to life through this plugin. And now I've already installed this plugin, so I'm going to jump over into my design tab here, and I'm going to scroll on down and add in the canvas main element. So that's just going to allow me to add a canvas onto my page. With this canvas, I'm just going to scroll on down and add a solid border around this for the time being, just so I can see where it sits on my page. And then I'm going to jump over into my layout tab, and I'm going to start by adding in a left-hand margin on this canvas. So I'm going to add 300 pixels of margin, so that way it will not be covered by my repeating group here once it scales down. And then for the width and height of this element, I'm going to set the width to be 940 pixels. And now the reason why I've selected 940 as the width is because my overall page is 1260 pixels. And then I'll need to factor in the 300 pixels of margin that I've added on the left. So 1260 take 300 is 960. But I'll also just need to factor in the 20 pixels of margin that I'm going to add on the right hand side of this element as well. So I'm going to add 20 pixels of margin on the right here. And that'll just ensure that it does not touch the right hand side of my page border. And then for the height of this element, I'm going to set the height to be 500 pixels. Just because the dimensions here now suit roughly the size of a Google Slide presentation. Of course, I'll be showing you later on how you can change the aspect ratio of this. But for the time being, now that we've added in the overall base framework of our page, I'd like to explain how we can actually create a new slide within our database and then have that displayed within our canvas. So I'm going to head to my group here, which is going to act like a button. I'm going to jump to my appearance tab, and I'm going to choose to start a new workflow every single time this is clicked. And within this workflow, the first thing we're going to do is create a new slide within our database. So we're going to head to our data actions here. I'm going to choose to create a new thing. The thing we'd like to create is, of course, a new slide. And when I'm creating this slide, the only thing I'm going to need to do for the time being is just register the presentation that this slide will belong to. So I'm going to head to my original presentation field, and I'm going to have this equal the same value as the current page presentation. And then from here, what I'd like to do is create a way to register that we need to display that new slide within my overall canvas here. And the way I can do that is by setting a custom state on my page. And so if you're not familiar with custom states, they're just a way to temporarily store data on your page without having to fetch anything from your database. And so what I'd like to do is store a custom state on my page that just recognizes which slide should be displayed within my main canvas element here. And the way to create a custom state is by first selecting on the actual overall page itself. So I have my presentation page here. I'm then going to select from the information icon on the right-hand side of my element inspector. And I'm going to select the option here to create a new custom state. And with this state, I'd just like to call this current slide. So this is just going to create a way to store some data about which slide should be displayed within my canvas at any given time. And so I'm going to set the state type here to be a slide. So if I scroll on down, I'll see the option here to reference my slide data type. I'm going to choose to create this. And now every single time I create a slide, what I'd like to do is update the value of this custom state to now store that slide that was just created. And so that way our canvas will just show a blank slide that we can start editing. And so I'm going to jump back into my workflow editor. And after I've selected to create a new slide within my database, I'm just going to type in the word state here. And I'm going to choose the action to set the state of an element. The element I'd like to set the state of is our overall presentation page. And the custom state I'll be setting is the only state on our page at this time, which is the current slide state. I'm going to set the value of this to be the result of step 1 in our workflow, which was where we had created our new slide. And while we're building out the workflow to set the state of which slide should be displayed on our page, I'd also like to do this for another situation on our page. So if I jump over to my design tab, what I'd like to do is actually select the image within our repeating group on the left-hand side. So as I'd mentioned before, this repeating group is going to display a list of all of the slides on the left-hand side of our page. And of course, similar to the real Google Slides application, what I'd like to do is update the slide that's displayed within our canvas every single time a specific slide is selected. And the way I can do that is just by creating a similar workflow step to what I had just done in my create slide workflow. So I'm going to start by clicking the image within our repeating group here. And then I'm going to choose to start a workflow every single time a user selects this image. And then within this, once again, I'm just going to type in the word state. And I'll select the action to set the state of an element. The element I would like to set the state of is once again my presentation page. The custom state will be the current slide. Only in this case, I'd like to set the value to be the current cell slide that's displayed within my repeating group. And now that we've set the custom state on our page to store the value of a slide, we'll just need a way to update the slide that's displayed within our canvas here. And this is where we can start leveraging some of the dynamic value fields within this canvas. And I'll be running you through what all of these mean when we start to build out all of the features, like being able to draw on a canvas, add text to it, or even add shapes or an image. But essentially what we'll just need to do is if we scroll on down to our dynamic fields here, you'll see with your canvas there's an option to add things like a background image. So by default, this field is going to be blank because when a brand new slide is created, there's of course going to be nothing on this canvas. So it's just going to be white. But what I could do is reference the value of the slide that's set within our custom state. And in that case, I just like to dynamically reference all of the things like the background image or the background color of that current slide. And so for the background image I'd like to display by default, I'm going to insert dynamic data, and I'm going to need to reference the slide within my custom state on the page. So I'm going to select from my overall presentation page, its current slide that's set in its custom state, its background image, and of course I'll be showing you in a moment how we can change the values of the background image using a picture uploader. I'm also just going to scroll up to the background color option here, because that is another setting that we're going to allow users to change today. I'd like to insert a dynamic value here and display the background color that's stored within the slide on our presentation page state. So I'm going to select from our presentation page, its current slide stored in the custom state, its background color, and that is actually all of the fields we'll need to just customize for the time being. When it comes to all of the content that will be drawn or written or added to this canvas, we're going to be creating a feature in a moment which will allow us to save all of the content that's added on this canvas. And that's where, if you remember, in our database we created the field called serialization. That's where we're actually going to store the value of all of that. The very last thing I'd like to do before we actually build out all of those features though, is just create one last workflow every single time this page is loaded. In which case, I'd just like to update once again the custom state of this page, because when a presentation is opened, I'd like to display the very first slide within it, within our canvas here. And so I'm just going to need to set the state to search through all of the slides that belong to this presentation. And then I'd just like to display the very first slide in my canvas. So I'm going to jump to my workflow editor here. I'm going to choose to create a new workflow. And I'd like this to run every single time the page is loaded. And within this workflow, I'm going to once again type in the word state. I'll select the action to set the state of an element. The element I would like to set the state on is our presentation page. The custom state will be the current slide state. And now for the value here, as I mentioned, what I'd like to do is perform a search in my database for all of the slides that belong to this particular presentation. And I'd like to display the very first item in my database, because that's going to be the first slide. So I'm going to perform a search here for all of these slides where the original presentation equals the same value as the current page presentation. And I'm going to select from the very first item. And now in that case, when a page is loaded, so when someone selects to open up a presentation, it's just going to ensure that the very first slide is automatically displayed within our canvas here. But from here, that's everything I wanted to cover when it comes to creating a new slide. What we could do is just take a quick preview as to what this application looks like from everything we've created so far. So I'm going to open up my home page and then start previewing the application, because we'll of course need to create a new presentation before we can create a new slide within it. Over on my home page here, I can currently see that I have no presentations created. So I'm just going to choose to select to create a new one. I'm going to call this test presentation. I will then select to create this. That workflow is going to run, and it's now going to redirect me through to my slide canvas page here. And at this point, you'll see that we currently don't have any slides here within our repeating group. So I'm going to choose to create a new slide. And then the custom state value would have been updated at this point. And for the time being, I can just draw on this canvas, as I haven't built out any other features that allows me to add any additional elements like images or shapes yet. That's what we're going to be focusing on throughout the very next step within our workflow. But for the time being, I just want to jump back into my Notion doc here and just check off that we've finished adding in all of the features to create a new slide within our presentation. And it's from this point on that we can start focusing on all of the exciting features within our build, which now allows us to build out and customize the content that's displayed within each slide itself. And from here, we can start building out the features that will allow us to make changes to our actual canvas. And the first one is going to be the ability to update the background color or the background image that's displayed on our canvas. And I actually briefly touched base on this just before when we had set the dynamic value of the background image on our canvas. But what I essentially want to do is create a button that when clicked displays an image uploader field as well as a color picker. And in that case, it will allow a user to determine what color or background image they'd like to set on their canvas. And I have a good example of what this is going to look like within my separate bubble editor here. So as you can see, I have a button here which displays the word background. And when it's clicked, it's going to display a group on our page that will not only feature a picture uploader element, but also a color picker element. And then when a user chooses to save the values of both of those fields, I'd like it to update and store those values on the slide that's displayed on our page at the time. And so what we're going to do is just jump back into our bubble editor over here. And then on our presentation page here, I'm going to create that button element. So I'm just going to use a group with an icon and a text element within it. So if I was to scroll on down to my containers menu, I'm going to add yet another group within my existing red group here. I'm going to update the name of this to be called group background. And for the style of this group, I'm going to remove the style here and set the background color to be a flat color. I'm going to leave this as white. I'm then going to set the roundness of the borders of this group to be 10. And then when it comes to the layout of this group, I would like the container layout to be a column because I'll be stacking two elements in this vertically. And then I'm also going to update the width and height of this group. I'm going to set the width to be 100 pixels and then the height to be 60 pixels. And I'm going to select that both of these dimensions should be fixed because I don't want this button scaling up or down on our page. I'm going to want this to always remain the same consistent dimensions. So 100 pixels in width and 60 pixels in height. I'm then going to head over to my visual elements. I'm going to add in yet another icon element. Only this time I'm going to type in the word camera and select from this camera icon. And I'm going to update the layout of this icon so I can set the width of this to be 25 pixels and then the height of this to be 25 pixels. I'm also going to want to align this in the center of my group. And then finally, I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, just so it pushes the icon down so it's roughly in the center of my group there. I'm then going to select a text element. I'm going to add it into my group. And I'm going to have this display the word background. I'm going to remove the style of this text element because I'd like to align the actual text within the center of the element itself. I'm then going to jump over to my layout tab here and I'm going to update the responsive settings so this text actually fits within this group I've added. So I'm going to unselect that this element should be fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0 and the maximum width to be infinite. I'm also going to set the minimum height to be 0. And now you'll see that text element fits nicely within my group. So it looks more like a button at the time being. The last thing I might do on this button is just select on the overall group itself. And I might just head down to my margins tab here and just add in 10 pixels of margin on the left. So that way this button is no longer touching the previous button we had added. But now what I'd like to do is create an experience that when this group is clicked as a button, it displays another group below this on our page that will feature not only a picture uploader element, but also a color picker element. And I'm going to want this group to essentially hover over any of the elements that sit on our page. Similar to a floating group, I don't want this to actually be a group within any existing groups on my page. I'm going to want this to overlay on the top of it. But instead of choosing a floating group, what I'm going to choose is the group focus element. And now the difference between a floating group and a group focus element is that, like a floating group, a group focus element will in fact hover over any elements on your page. So that's the exact experience we want to create. But the other thing I'd just like to note is that the difference here is that with a group focused element, you can select a reference element that this group should sit next to at all times. So if I was to select my reference element to be my group background that I've just added, what you'll see is that this group will now be positioned directly under this. And because I would like to essentially display a group over the top of our page that is always positioned under this button here, a group focus is the best element to use. I'm going to update the name of this to be called group focus background image. When it comes to the style of this group, I'm just going to remove the style here and just update the color of this to be white. I'd like to set the roundness here to be 10 for my borders. And under the layout tab here, I'm going to set the container layout to be a row because I'm going to want to stack two elements next to each other within our group. And then if I was to also update the dimensions of this element, I'm going to keep this fixed width. I'm going to set the width to be 420 pixels. And then the height to be 165 pixels. And now, of course, you can make this whatever height or width you'd like based on the elements that you're going to add within it. And we could, of course, readjust these if we find that we need more space at a later time. Now, what I am going to need to do is create a way to add in both a picture uploader element and a color picker element side by side, which we can do because our container layout is a row. But one thing you may have noticed in my example here is that we also have a save button, which is stacked directly below our picture uploader. And so in order to, of course, stack items vertically, we would need to use the column container layout. So what we can actually do is within our overall row group, we can add in one additional group to have a container layout that is a column, which will then allow us to stack elements vertically within our overall row group. So I'm going to jump into my bubble editor here, and I'm going to head to my containers menu. I'm going to add a group within my existing group, and I'm going to call this group background number 1. I'm going to set the container layout to be a column. I'm going to jump over to my appearance tab, and I'm going to remove the default style here because I'd like to set a flat color as the background. I might set the background color to be a light shade of green just so I can see where it sits within my overall group there. And from here, before I update the dimensions of this group, I'm just going to add the elements I'll need within this. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be storing a picture uploader element, and I'm going to update the name of this to be called picture uploader background. And then for the layout of this element, I'm going to keep this fixed width. Only in this case, I'm going to set the width to be 200 pixels by 100 pixels in height. And I'm just choosing these dimensions because I think that's roughly the same size as my overall canvas there, or I should say the same aspect ratio. And now below our picture uploader here, I'm going to add in a button element. So I'm going to head to my visual elements. I'll select to add in a button, and this will display the word save. And when it comes to the dimensions of this button, I'm going to head to my layout tab. I will set the width of this to also be 200 pixels, so that way it's in line with the picture uploader element above it. But I'll just update the height here to be, let's say, 35 pixels, just so that way it doesn't take up as much space. What I'd also like to do is add 10 pixels of margin at the top of my button here, so that way it just ensures that it won't touch the picture uploader element above it there. And from here, what I'm going to need to do is update the dimensions of the green group that both of these elements sit within. And of course, that will just ensure that it is fully responsive within my white focus group. But before I do that, what I'd like to do is actually add in my color picker element, just because when I unselect that this element is fixed width and set no maximum width, it's going to automatically scale and take up all the rest of the space within my white focus group. So before I do that, I'm just going to need to add in my color picker element, just so that way the green group leaves space for this element. So I'm going to add my color picker into my overall white focus group here, and I'm going to set the width of this element to be 190 pixels, and then the height of this element to be 145 pixels. And then from here, I am going to select on my green group within my overall focus group. I'm going to unselect that this element is fixed width, and I'm going to set the minimum width of this to be 0. And then of course you'll see the color picker element has now collapsed beside the green group here. But the very last thing I'll need to do within my green group is just remove the minimum height here. I'll set that to 0 so that way it will collapse around all of the elements within it. And then I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin on each side of my color picker element. So I'm going to set 10 pixels of margin at the left, 10 on the right. And then I might even do the same for my green group here. So I'm going to select on the green group. And I'm just going to add 10 pixels of margin on the left. I won't need to add 10 pixels of margin on the right because I've already added 10 pixels of margin on the left of my color picker. So there is space between both those elements. And then if I really wanted, I could even add 10 pixels of margin at the top of that group, and then 10 pixels of margin at the top of my color picker. And now you'll find both of those elements are roughly centered within my focus group. What I would like to do from here though is create a workflow to save the values of the background image or the background color that have been selected. Because of course I'd like those to update and be displayed on our actual canvas element here. So I'm going to click on my save button here, and I'm going to choose to create a new workflow every single time this is clicked. And when this workflow runs, I'm going to head to my data tab, and I'd like to make changes to a thing. The thing I would like to change is the current slide that is stored on our page's custom state. So I'm going to head to our presentation page. I'm going to identify the current slide that is being displayed and edited. And from here, I'd like to change, first of all, the background color of this presentation slide. And in this case, I'd like this to equal the value of my color picker element. So I'm going to select on the canvas color picker option here, its value. And then I'd also like to store the value of the background image. I'm going to want this to be the picture uploader background, its value. And of course, one thing I will point out is that if any of these input elements has no value, so if they're currently empty, it's just going to leave the value in our database blank. And of course, if there's an existing value, it's just going to update that here. The last thing I'd like to do within this workflow is just choose to hide my group focus element, because I'll no longer want it to be displayed on my page. So I'm going to head to my workflow editor here, and I'm going to add an additional step. I'm going to type in the word toggle, and I'll select to toggle an element. The element I'd like to toggle in this case is just my group focus element for my background image. And one thing I will note is that this group focus element won't be displayed on our page by default. We're going to need to also create a workflow that will toggle this to ensure it can be displayed. So if I click on my background image button here that we've created, I'm going to choose to start a workflow every single time that's clicked. And I'm going to once again choose to toggle an element here. And this element will of course be our focus group. And so now that will allow us to hide and display this group every single time we click this button. Before I show you a quick preview of how that functions though, the very last thing I'd like to do is just store a default value within these two input fields. So let's say a user has already selected a custom color they'd like to store within their background and they've already saved that. When they open up this group focus element again, what I'd like to do is display the default value of the color that they've already selected. And the way I could do this is by yet again adding in a dynamic default value. So under our color picker element here, if we scroll on down to the default color, what I'm going to do is remove the standard option there, and I'm going to insert dynamic data, and I'd like to display the presentation page, its current slide that's stored in our custom state, the background color of that slide. And then I'd also like to do the same for our picture upload element here. So if a background image has already been uploaded, I'd like to display that within this field by default. So I'm going to choose to insert dynamic data, and I will display the presentation page, its current slide custom state, the background image that has been saved within that current slide. And I'm also just going to want to process this image with Imgix. just because I personally like selecting to resize the dimensions of this image by cropping them, which just ensures that the image stretches out to be the full dimensions of the picture uploader element here. And now one thing I will note is that if I was to click on my overall canvas here, we had already taken the time to display the dynamic data for both the background color here as well as the background image. Because we're saving those values within our database based on the slide within our current page's custom state, we can reference those values at any given time within our canvas. And of course, when someone selects to open a different slide and the custom state on our page is updated, it's going to automatically know which particular background color or image to display. And now what I'd love to do is to show you a quick preview of how this is all going to function within our application. So I'm going to head over to my home page here. I'm going to preview my application once again, and I'm going to select from my test presentation here, which the image field is currently blank because we haven't actually learned how to save a preview image of a slide yet. I'll be getting to that later on. But if I select in the repeating group here, it's going to redirect me through to this page. And then over on my presentation page, it's automatically going to load my first slide, which is currently blank. If I'd like to set a background color for this slide, I could select my background button. It's going to toggle my focus group here. Let's say I want to make the background color red. I'm going to select that. I can then choose to save that color. It's going to then toggle my focus group again, so it's now hidden. And it's also going to update the background color of my canvas here. And of course, the same goes with adding in a background image. If I wanted to upload an image from my own local device here, I can use my picture uploader element to do that. And then once I save this background image, that workflow is going to run and it will automatically update the image that's displayed within my overall canvas. If I jump back into my Notion doc, I'm just going to check off that we've finished building out the feature to update not only the background image, but also the background color of our canvas on our page. And of course, I also explained how we could save those values within our database. So that way, once we revisit the page, any settings we had saved will of course now be loaded by default. And now from here, we'll be moving on to the next core set of features that we'll be adding into our Google Slides clone. So being able to add text, shapes, and even images onto the canvas itself. But before I do that, I'm going to just jump back over into my bubble editor and quickly show you how you can update the aspect ratio of your canvas slide. Just because if you remember, I had set my own custom width and height onto my canvas slide here. So I had set the width at 940 pixels and then the height at 500. But let's say you wanted to just keep a consistent aspect ratio on your canvas here. You can actually add that in through the Appearance tab. What you'll see here is a field that allows you to add in a fixed aspect ratio, as I just mentioned. And if you were to open up the documentation here, it'll just explain how you can actually add these aspect ratios in. So essentially all you'd have to do is just grab a standard aspect ratio. So let's say you wanted it to be 16:8. Instead of separating both of those numbers with a semicolon, you would add these numbers in the exact same order, only you'd separate them with a full stop. So if I wanted to set a fixed aspect ratio of 16:8, I just type in 16 full stop 8. And now this will just ensure that your canvas is fixed at this particular aspect ratio every single time it is loaded. But for the sake of our tutorial today, I'm just going to remove this aspect ratio because I don't want that to be fixed. I'm happy with the settings that I've customized for the width and height here. And now that I've explained how to customize your own aspect ratio, I do want to move along to the next core feature we'll be adding, which just enables us to continually edit the canvas in the way we would like. So up to this point in our tutorial, I've taken the time to explain how you can add a custom background image or color to the canvas. But what I'd now like to do is explain how you can add text onto the canvas. So within the canvas element, you'll have the ability to add things like drawing, text, shapes, or even images. And these are all controlled through a field here called cursor mode. And what you'll see is that by default, the cursor mode is selected as the free draw / paint option, which just means that over in your preview of your canvas, what you'll see is that you have the ability to draw on the canvas by default. But what would happen if you wanted to change the type of cursor action that occurs on the canvas? Let's say we want to be able to add text or even add shapes, or just perhaps select the items themselves that we'd like to move around on the canvas. This is what I want to walk us through next within our tutorial. And the first cursor mode I'd like to create is the ability to add text onto our canvas. And thankfully, this is actually a fairly straightforward process to integrate into our Google Slides application. The first thing we're going to do is just add in a menu button within our header group here. And then when that button is clicked, I'm going to create a custom state within our canvas that will just allow us to switch over the cursor mode to not be the free draw paint option, but instead be the add text option. And so to simplify the whole process, I'm going to start by selecting on our background group here. I'm going to make a copy of this, and I'm going to update the name of this to be called group text. I'm then going to select the icon that sits within this group, and I'm going to search for a text icon here. So I'll choose the icon with the letter T here, and then I'm going to select on the text that sits within this group, and I'm just going to type in the word text. I'm then going to want to reduce just the width of this group. I'm just going to head to my layout tab on the overall group. And for the width of this element, I will still want this to be fixed, but I'm going to set the width to be 60 pixels, not 100, just because I don't need so much empty space on the sides of my text and icon element. And now what I'd like to do from here is create a workflow that updates which type of cursor mode should be selected. And in this case, I'd want it to be our text option. And in order to determine which cursor mode should be displayed within my canvas here, I'm going to add a couple of different custom states onto my page that just allows me to reference which button has been clicked from our header menu here. And of course, I'd like our canvas to update accordingly based on the option. And so when it comes to adding a custom state, I'm going to click on my overall page here. So this is the presentation element. I'm then going to open up my information icon here. And under our existing custom state that we've added, I'd like to add another one. And for the name of this state, I'm going to be calling this text mode. And then I'm going to set this state type to be a yes or no option, because we either are going to be in text mode or we're not going to be in text mode. I'm going to choose to create this. And I'd like to set the default value of this state to be no, because by default, I don't want to be in our text mode. Instead, I would like us to automatically be in our draw mode once the page is loaded. But what I'd like to now do though is select our group here that acts as a button. And when this group is clicked, I'd like to change the custom state on our page, because I'd like to update that the text mode should now equal yes. And then I'll create a condition within my main canvas that corresponds accordingly. So I'm going to head to my text button here. I'm going to scroll on up and choose to start a workflow every single time this is clicked. And within this workflow, I'm just going to type in the word state, because I'd like to set the state of an element. The element that I would like to set the state of is our overall page, so our presentation here. The custom state I would like to set is the text mode option, and I would like to set the value of this to now equal yes. If I would like, I could also even color code this workflow here. I'm going to set this to be blue. And the reason I'm doing that is because I'm about to add in quite a few different workflows to update the different custom states for our cursor modes. And this will just allow me to tell them apart from any other workflows on our page. I'm then going to jump back into my design tab, open up my canvas element inspector here. And as I mentioned, I'm going to need to create a condition that just recognizes if the custom state of our page, if its text mode state is yes, I would like to update the cursor mode on this element. So I'm going to define a new condition here, and I'm going to recognize when the presentation page, so I'm going to scroll on down to the presentation option. when its text mode custom state is yes, I would like to select that the cursor click mode here should now be set to the add text option. And if I was to jump over into the preview of my application here and just refresh the page, what I'll see is that I now have the ability to select our text button here, and when I click that, it's going to run that workflow. It's going to update the custom state that was added onto our page. And now what you'll see is that with my cursor, I no longer have the ability to draw on this canvas. Instead, if I was to click on this canvas somewhere, I can add text anywhere I would like within the constraints of this element's borders. And one thing I will just point out is that by default, this text is going to be black. If you would like to create a way to update the color or even the formatting of this text, you could add yet another group focus element onto the page with a color picker element. And that would just allow the user to determine what color or size they would like their text to be. But I'm not going to jump too much into detail about that because I have explained how to create a similar experience within our group focus element here. So you just need to replicate that. Instead, what I would like to do is just move on to the next cursor mode that we're going to add onto our canvas here. And that is the ability to add shapes. So I'm just going to hide my group focus element for now. I'm going to then click on my text group button here. I'm going to make a copy of that. Only this time I'm going to update the name of this to be called group shape. And within this group, I'm going to select the icon element here. I'm going to update this to just be a circle to represent that it is a shape. I will select on the text and I'll update this to display the word shape. And now when this group is clicked as a button, what I'd like to do is create a very similar experience to when our text group was clicked. So I'm going to want to first add a custom state to our page. And then when this button is clicked, I'd like to update the value that's stored within that custom state. And of course, create a condition on our canvas that then recognizes that the state has been changed. And so what I'm going to do is first of all, select on my page here. I'm going to head to my information icon once again. I'm going to add yet another custom state, and I'll be calling this custom state shape mode. I will set the state type here to be the yes, no option. I will choose to create that, and I'll make sure that I set the default value of this state to be no, because by default, I don't want the shape mode to be the option that a user can add onto our canvas. I want the draw mode to be the first choice. And while we're here, before I actually build out the workflow to update this custom state, what I could do is just finish adding in all of the different custom states for the different cursor modes that we have. It'll just save me having to jump back and forward between my workflow editor, then my element inspector to create a new state. So I'm just going to add another custom state here. And the next custom state I would like to add is going to be called the select mode state. So this is just going to put our canvas in a mode where we can actually select and move around any elements we've added onto it. So things like images, text, or even drawing markers. And of course, I'm going to set the state type to be a yes, no option. I'll create that, and I'll set the default value to be no. The only other state I would like to factor in is just our draw mode option. So of course, by default, our canvas will in fact be in draw mode. But one thing we will need to factor is that a user may click away from draw mode. So let's say they want to add some shapes onto the canvas. They would click this button, it would update the state. But what happens if they would then like to revert back to draw mode? We're just going to need to create a button and a workflow that will allow them to do that. So I'm going to add one last custom state here. I'll be calling this draw mode. I'll set the state type to be the yes, no option. I will create that. Only this time I'm going to set the default value of this to be yes, because I do want the draw mode to be the default option for our canvas here. And then once I've finished adding in all of our different custom states, I'm going to head to my shape button here. I'm going to choose to start edit a workflow. And within this workflow, I'm once again going to type in the word state. I'll choose to set the state of an element. The element I'll be setting the state of is our presentation page. And the custom state that I would like to select is going to be our shape mode. I'm going to set the value of this to now be yes. But while I'm here, one thing I would like to point out is that because I am setting the value of our shape mode to be yes, I actually would also like to switch all of the other custom states values to equal no, just to ensure that they aren't turned on or active at any given time while this cursor mode is. So I'm going to choose to set the value of another custom state, and I'm going to need to set the values of all of the different cursor mode states to equal no. So I'm going to start with our draw mode option here. I'd like to ensure that when our shape mode is selected, our draw mode is turned off. I'm then going to set another state. I'll choose from our select mode. I'll make sure that its value is now switched to no. And then I would also just like to set the state of our text mode. I'm going to make sure that that is set to no. And now that will ensure that only one custom state cursor mode is active at once. I'm then going to select on my workflow trigger here. And as I mentioned before, I'm going to update the event color to be blue. One thing I will point out is that we are going to need to make some changes to the very first workflow that we had created. So when we had set the text mode state to be yes, we hadn't turned off all of the additional custom states that we've just added. So we're also going to need to update those states now as well. So for the custom state of our draw mode, I'd like that to equal no. I'd also like the custom state of the select mode to equal no. Then from here, I'm going to select that the shape mode will need to equal no. And now that will just ensure that only one mode is currently active, and that is our text mode here. Before we then go and build out the buttons for the additional custom state modes here, we are going to need to set a condition on our canvas that just recognizes when our shape button is clicked and its custom state is set to yes, because of course I'd like to update the behavior that that canvas has at that point in time. So I'm going to jump to my design tab here, click on my overall canvas, and open up my conditional tab here. And within this tab, I'm going to define another condition here. In this case, I'm going to recognize when the presentation page, so if I scroll on down, I'll see the overall page here, when its shape mode state is set to yes, I would like to update the cursor click mode to now equal the shape option, so the draw shape choice there. And once I've added that condition, I can start building out the additional buttons I'd like to add within my menu here. So I'm going to click on my shape group button there. I'm going to make a copy of that, and I'm going to update this to be called group draw. So this is going to be the button that allows a user to update the custom state to be put in draw mode. So for our icon within this group, I'm just going to search for a pencil icon. I'll select this choice here. I will select the text below that and just type in the word draw. And now when it comes to this group, when it is clicked, I'm going to start a workflow here. Because we're updating the cursor mode custom state for our canvas, I'm going to set the event color here to be blue, just so it matches the rest of the workflows I had created. And now in order to streamline the process of building out this workflow, I'm actually going to open up an existing blue workflow here. I'm going to right click on this workflow step and choose to copy it. I'm then going to open up our new workflow here. I'll right click again and paste that in. And now all I'll need to do within this is just update the value of which custom state I'd like to turn on and which ones I'd like to turn off. So in this case, I just want to make sure that my draw mode state, its value is yes. And then I'd just like to switch off the shape mode state to be no. And just double check that all of my additional custom states are also set to no. I'm then going to jump back into my design tab from here, click on my canvas, open up my condition tab, and I'm going to define a new condition. And in this case, I'm going to recognize when the presentation page, when its draw mode custom state is yes, I'm going to update the cursor click mode here. I will have this be the free draw paint option. And then finally, there is one last button I would like to add onto our header menu here for our cursor click mode, and that is the selection option. So I'm going to copy this button one more time. I will update the name of this to be called group select. I'm going to then click on the icon here, and I will update this to be a mouse, so just a cursor. And I'm going to click on the text, and I'll have this display the word resize. And then finally, when this overall button is clicked, I'm going to want to start a workflow here. I'm going to update the event color to be blue. I'm then going to right click and paste in the very same workflow step that I had copied before. I'm going to make sure that the state modes are currently set to no for everything else but the select mode option. So I'm going to set that the value for my select mode should now equal yes. And then of course, I'll just jump back into my design tab here, open up my canvas and create a condition that just recognizes when the select mode state is yes, in which case I'd want to update the cursor click mode within the canvas itself. So I'm going to define another new condition here, and I'm going to recognize when the presentation page, so the presentation option, I'll move my element inspector up a bit as well. So when the presentation page, when its select mode equals yes, I would like to update the cursor click mode here to be the select elements option. And that's actually the very last condition we'll need to add here, because that now caters for all of our different cursor click modes that I'd like to run through in our tutorial today. As I mentioned, if you did want to customize the way that these, let's say, shapes or text are colored or styled within the canvas, you can by all means add another group focus element next to that menu option. And then you can store a value for what the color code should be. So in your appearance tab here for the actual canvas element, if you scroll on down, you'll see that you have an option here to update the default color for all of the different cursor modes. And so if you were to just update the default option for the draw mode color or even the shape color, you could just set that to be the value of whatever color is selected within your color picker. But for the sake of our tutorial today, I just want to leave these as they are. But of course, I just wanted to make sure I at least touch base on that so you know it is possible to customize these particular inputs. But from here, what I want to do is jump over into my bubble editor now, because what you'll see is that I have all of my additional cursor mode menu options here. So by default, what you'll see is that I can draw on my canvas here. If I would like to, let's say, add a shape onto my canvas, I can now drag this out. It will add that shape in. And if I would like to resize any of these elements, I can select on my resize button. I can then click on any of the custom text or shapes that I've added onto this particular canvas. And I can either drag these out, make it larger, smaller, or even just move them around on my overall canvas, just like you would with a regular PowerPoint slide. What I want to do from here though is just jump back into my bubble editor, because we've just covered quite a bit when it comes to actually making our canvas completely functional. So I just want to tick off that we've covered the process of updating the aspect ratio of the actual canvas size itself, as well as the ability to add text boxes, add shapes, and then even resize elements that have been added onto the canvas slide. And from here, the next thing that I want to cover is how you can actually upload additional images that you'd like to display on the canvas itself. And when it comes to actually adding in any additional images onto the canvas itself, this process mimics almost the same experience that we had created when we allowed a user to upload a custom background photo for the actual overall canvas background. And so all of this should seem pretty straightforward by this point in our tutorial. But what I'm going to want to do is jump over into my bubble editor here. I'm going to just hide this first focus group that I've added onto my page, because what I'd like to do is add an additional menu button option here, followed by another focus group that will just allow a user to upload an image into a picture uploader element. And so I'm going to start by first of all adding in an additional menu button, as I mentioned. So I'm going to click on my select button here. I'm going to make a copy of that. I'm then going to pull my element inspector down, and I'm going to update the name of this. And I'm going to call this group upload image. I'm then going to select on the icon within this group, I'm going to type in the word picture. I'll select this picture icon here, and then I will update the text within this group to display the word image. And now when this button is clicked, what I'd like to do is display another focus group that features a picture uploader element. And then once a user has uploaded an image into that picture uploader, I'd like to run a workflow that just adds that image onto our canvas, which they can then choose to select and resize at any given time. And so I'm going to scroll on down through our elements option here. I'm going to choose to add yet another group focus element onto my page. I'll be updating the name of this to be called group focus upload image. And the reference element will of course be our group upload image. And then when it comes to this group, I'm just going to remove the style of this because I'd like to set the background color to be a flat color of white. I'd then like to jump over into my layout tab and set the container layout to be a column because I want to stack two elements within this on top of each other. So they're going to be top to bottom. I'm going to keep the width fixed. Only in this case, I'll just set the width to be 230 pixels. And then for the height, I would also like to keep that fixed, but I'm going to update this to be 165 pixels. And what you'll just now see is that we have a small focus group here, which of course won't be visible on our page until we create a workflow that displays it. But it's always going to be fixated to our image button here that we've added onto the page. Within this group, I'm going to add in a picture uploader element. So I'm going to select to add that in here. And I'll be updating the name of this to be called picture uploader image upload. Just so that way when I'm referencing this element within the workflow I'm about to create, I can tell it apart from the previous picture uploader we'd used for our background image. And then within our layout settings here, I'm going to make sure this picture uploader is centered within our focus group here. I'm going to unselect that it should have a fixed width, and I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, as well as keep the maximum width to be infinite. And I'm actually quite happy to leave the height of this element fixed at 140 pixels. One thing I would like to do is just add in 10 pixels of margin on the left, 10 on the right, and 10 at the bottom of this element, just to ensure that it doesn't touch the borders of our focus group itself. And then below this, I'm going to add in a button element, which will be used to trigger a workflow to upload this image onto our canvas. So I'm going to head to our visual elements here. I'm going to choose to add in a button. And what I can see is that I'm just going to need to expand the height of my focus group. So I'm going to jump to my layout tab here. And instead of having this be a fixed height, I'm going to unselect that. I'll set the minimum height to be 0. And leave this option here ticked, which fits the height of this group to the content that sits within it. Just because I'd like to still add some margins at the top and bottom of this button. So I'm going to want this focus group to expand accordingly. And for this button, I'm going to update the name of this to be called button image upload save. And of course, I'd like to horizontally align this within the center of my focus group. I'm then also going to unselect that this element's width should be fixed. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, the maximum width to be infinite. And then for the actual height of this element, I'm going to keep this at 35 pixels here. And then from here, I'm going to add 10 pixels of margin around every single border of this button. And that'll just ensure that it doesn't touch any of the surrounding elements. I'm then going to jump to my appearance tab and update the text of this button to display the word save. And then from here, I'm going to choose to start a new workflow every single time this button is clicked. And within this, I'm going to type in the word add image. And you'll see an option here to add an image to your canvas. And for the value of the image that I want to add to my canvas, I'm obviously going to want this to be the same value that's stored within our new picture uploader input. So I'm going to set a value under the dynamic image here. I'm going to insert dynamic data. And I'd like this to pull the image from our picture uploader image upload input, its value. And one thing I would like to point out is that when an image is uploaded, you can choose to customize the coordinates that it's added within your canvas. And so at this point, it's just going to add the image 10 pixels in from the top and side of your image. If you'd also like, you could even add in a custom width and height for the images that are uploaded. For today's example, I'm just going to set these at 200, which is just going to ensure that we have some control over the original size of the images that are uploaded onto our canvas. Of course, using the cursor mode of select will allow us to resize this image as we please. But when it's uploaded onto my canvas, I don't want it to overwhelm the user. I just want it to take up a small portion of the overall canvas. But this is all we'll need to edit when it comes to this particular workflow step. What I'd like to do now is then just make sure I hide the group focus element that's displayed on our page. So when this image button is clicked here, we will need to create a workflow to actually display our group focus element. But of course, once a user has saved an image that they would like to upload, I'd just like to hide that group. So I'm going to jump back into my workflow editor, add an additional step here, and I'm just going to head to my element actions and choose to hide an element. The element I would like to hide is going to be my group focus upload image. And of course, because I'm hiding this element, I'm first going to need to actually show this element on our page. So as I mentioned, when this image button is clicked here, I'm going to choose to start a workflow. And within this workflow, I'd like to show an element. So I'm going to head to my element actions option. I'm going to select from the show option here. And then I'm going to set that the element I would like to show is our group focus upload image. And that's actually all we'll need to add in for this particular experience. I'm going to jump over into the preview of my application and refresh this page. And from here, if I would like to add an image onto my canvas, I can select my button here. My group focus element will be displayed. I can then choose to upload a custom image from my local device here. And then once I've uploaded an image within my picture uploader, I'm going to choose to save that onto my canvas. And that workflow will run, which of course hides the actual group focus element. And then it's going to add our image onto the canvas in the top right hand corner, as I mentioned. If I would like to resize and move this image around, I can do so by selecting my resize cursor mode here. And then I could of course scale this up or down and place it wherever I would like on my canvas. And one thing I will point out is that you can actually upload as many different images as you would like onto your canvas. You're not just restricted to one. And of course, these images are separate from our background image. Our background image permanently takes up the whole background of our canvas, whereas these images are added as a layer on top of that. So now that we know how to add an image onto our canvas, I'm just going to quickly jump back into my Notion doc and check off that we've finished running through that process. And then from here, I just want to move along to the very last core feature that we'll be adding onto our canvas. And that is the ability to copy and paste any existing elements on the canvas itself. And given what we've learned up to this point in our tutorial, this feature couldn't be more easy to implement. Essentially, what we're going to need to do is just add in 2 additional menu buttons and just create 2 really straightforward workflows. So we're going to jump over into our bubble editor here. And as I mentioned, we're going to add in some additional buttons into our top menu here. I'm just going to close this focus group that I had open there. I'm going to select on my upload image group button. I'm going to make a copy of that. And then I'm going to update the icon within this group to be a paperclip. So I'm going to search through my icon element here. I'm going to select the paperclip. I'm then going to update the text to display the word copy. And I'll also just need to update the name of this group. So I'm going to call this group copy. And then whenever this group is clicked, it's going to act as a button. And we're going to copy whatever item is selected within our canvas. So I'm going to choose to start edit a workflow whenever this button is clicked. And I'm going to, within this, type in the word copy. And I'll be selecting the option here that states copy selected elements on a canvas. I'm going to choose that. And that's actually as simple as the process is. Of course, we're going to need to create a way to paste items in from there. And that process is just as simple. So we're going to jump over to our design tab. I'm going to click on my overall group that's acting as a button once again. I'm going to make an additional copy of that. Only this time I'm going to update the name of this group to be called group paste. I'm then going to select the icon and I will type in the word clipboard, and I'll select from this clipboard icon here. And of course, I'll update this text to display the word paste. And whenever this group, which acts as a button, is clicked, I'm going to want to start a workflow. And I'm going to type in the word paste, and you'll now see the option to paste elements on the canvas. And that's as simple as the process is for copying and pasting elements onto our canvas. Before we take a quick preview of that in action though, what I would like to do is just actually update the height of our red container group that stores all of our menu buttons. So I mentioned at a later point I was going to come back and update this, and it's at this time in our tutorial that I'd like to do that now. There are still some additional buttons that I'd like to add within this group, but I know that the height will remain consistent as the height of all of my groups here are consistently the same pixel size. So I'm going to select on my overall red group. I'm going to jump over to my layout tab here, and for the minimum height, I'm going to set this to be 0. And because I have selected this option here to fit the height of this element to the content within it, it of course is going to collapse around all of my buttons there. One thing I am going to do is just add in some margin on my canvas element here, just so there's some space between my header menu and the actual canvas that we are designing on. So I'm going to click on the overall canvas here, and I'm going to add, let's say, 30 pixels of margin at the top. And now that'll just separate my menu from the actual canvas on my page. If I was to jump over into the preview of my application, I'm just going to refresh this page for the time being. And one thing I'd like to point out is that we haven't yet created a way to save all of the changes we're making on our canvas. So you can now see that any of the drawings, the shapes, and the images that I had previously added are no longer visible on this canvas. We of course will be touching base on that within the next step of my tutorial. What I would like to do though is just draw a pencil across my canvas here, just so I have an actual element on the canvas itself. I'm then going to choose my select cursor mode, and what you'll see is that I have the ability to of course resize this or move this around within my canvas. But let's say I'd like to duplicate this particular element. What I can do is choose to make a copy of that, and then I can select the paste button here, and you now see that it has pasted another version of that on my canvas. If you'd even like, you could display an alert message after the step in your workflow when the copy button is clicked, just so that way the user actually knows that it has been copied to the clipboard. But all I wanted to do within this quick step of our tutorial is just walk you through how you could actually create a copy and paste feature within your Google Slides canvas here. I'm going to jump back into my Notion doc now and just check off that we've finished walking through that feature. Because the next feature I wanted to focus on, as I just mentioned before, is the ability to actually now save any changes that we make onto the current slide that we're viewing in our presentation page. And this is actually a fairly straightforward feature to integrate within our build. So what we're going to do is just jump over into our bubble editor here, and we're going to add yet another menu selection within our header menu. Only this time, instead of creating a button-like element, I'm just going to add in a text element that when clicked will display yet another focus group. So I'm going to head over to my visual elements here, and I will select to add a text element into our red group. And this text element is just going to display the word file. But what I'd like to do is actually display an arrow icon next to this text that just prompts the user that it's going to open up a drop-down menu when they click on this text. And within that drop-down menu, we're going to allow our users to either save or download their presentation. And so in order to add an icon next to a text element, I'm going to show you a great little trick that allows you to do that within this element here using some HTML. So beside my word file, I'm going to add an open square bracket followed by the letters FA and then a closed square bracket. From here, I'm then going to type in the name of the icon I'd like to display. And in this case, it's going to be arrow-down because I'd like to display a downward arrow. And then I'll just need to close off the formatting of my HTML. So I'm going to add yet another open square bracket, a / followed by the letters FA and then a closed square bracket. And what you'll now see is that this HTML will format and it will structure an icon element next to my text. And from here, what I'm going to do is just jump over to my layout tab because I'd now like to update the responsive settings of this particular element, as well as its position in my overall red group. So I'm going to start by vertically aligning this element in the center of my red group. I'm then going to keep my width of this element fixed because I just like this to be 60 pixels in width, which just means it's going to collapse around the actual text that sits within this element. I'm also going to set my minimum height to be 0, so that way there's no empty space at the bottom of this element and it sits quite nicely around the text itself. And then finally, I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin on the left of this element because I obviously don't want it touching the button that it sits beside. And now when this particular text is clicked within our menu, I'd like to display yet another focus group on our page. So I'm going to scroll on down to my containers here, and I'm going to add in a group focus element. I'll add this anywhere on my page. And when it comes to this element, I'm going to jump over to our appearance tab here, and I'm going to set the reference element to be the text that we've just added in. So I'm going to type in the text file, and that will allow me to select the actual text that I've just added into my menu, and you'll now see that it is positioned nicely below that. I can also just remove the style of this and set the background color to be white. And when it comes to the layout of this group, I'm going to set this to be a column because I'll be stacking some items in this from top to bottom. And then when it comes to configuring the rest of the responsive settings, I'm just going to add in my elements into this group before I make any changes here, but we will be coming back to that. And the very first element I would like to add within this particular focus group is just yet again another text element that is going to act like a button. So I'm going to add this into our focus group here, and I'd like this text element to display the word save. And I'm also going to want to include an icon before that text. So similar to my file text that we've added onto our page here, I'm going to add in some HTML to display an icon. So I'm going to add yet another open square bracket, the letters FA, a closed square bracket. And in this case, I just want to display a save icon. So I'm going to type in the word save. And then I'll just need to close off the formatting of this HTML. So I'll add a open square bracket, /FA, and then a closed square bracket. And now you'll see that will format to be a floppy disk, which just signifies to the user that this will be the button they'll need to click in order to save their project. And so after I've added in the icon, I'm going to type in the word save here. And then when it comes to the layout settings of this particular element, I will just update the width of this to be 60 pixels in width. And I'll be keeping that fixed width because I don't need it to take up any additional space within my group here. I'm also then going to set the minimum height to be 0, so that way it fits nicely around the content within that element. And then finally, I could add 10 pixels of margin at the top and 10 on the left if I would like. And that's just going to ensure that it doesn't touch the borders of my focus group that it sits within. And then finally, I'm just going to make a duplicate of this text element here. Only this time I'm going to update the icon and text within it to display the word download. And of course, the difference between saving and downloading is that saving allows us to save what a user has added to a project, whereas downloading will allow a user to download the actual file as a PNG. And so I'm going to jump over to my appearance tab here, and then I'm just going to swap out the text within my HTML formatting here. I'm going to have this display the word download. And now that's going to display a download icon. And then finally, I'll update the text beside it to also say the word download. Only this time, I'm just going to need to extend out the width of this element. I'll jump to my layout tab and I'll make this 70 pixels instead of 60, which I can see just still isn't quite enough there. So I'm just going to make it 100. And now you'll see that all of that text is on one line. And after I finish configuring the layout settings for this element, I can just update the remaining settings in my focus group here. So I'm going to select my focus group, and I am going to want to keep this fixed width. I'm going to set the width at 120 pixels. And then I'll set the height to be 80 pixels. And what you'll now see is that this focus group will collapse nicely around all of the elements that sit within it. And of course, in order to display this focus group, I'm going to need to build out a workflow that allows it to be shown. And so I'm going to create a new workflow every single time this file text is clicked, in which case it's going to act like a button. I'll jump to my Appearance tab here and choose to start a new workflow. And within this workflow, I'd like to obviously just show my focus group. And now one thing I will point out is that you can either choose from the element action, which is show, or you can also choose to toggle the focus group. So I'm just going to choose to toggle this focus group here, and I'll just make sure that the element I am toggling is our focus group. And in order to identify which particular group I'm working with, I'm just going to quickly jump back and give a name to my focus group. I can see it's on the left-hand side of my page here. I'm going to call this focus group file menu. And then if I jump back into my workflow editor, the element that I would like to toggle is going to be my focus group file menu. And so now this will allow that focus group to be displayed every single time this text is clicked. And now from here, what I'd like to do is actually build out the workflows that's going to save and also eventually download this presentation within our overall page here. And so in order to just make this a little bit easier to follow, I'm just going to move this focus group element back over to the position below our heading here, just so you can get a real sense of where it's going to sit on our page. I'm then going to click on my save text here, and I'm going to create a workflow every single time this element is clicked. And now within this workflow, there's two particular steps I would like to add. The first is that I would like to save the serialization of my current Canvas slide. And so the purpose of the serialization is to just create a record of all of the elements that have been added to your canvas. So that's essentially just going to be like a long string of text that just says that you've got a shape at this point on your axes, or even the fact that you've got a background image or a particular background color. And this serialization just allows you to reference an existing version of a slide every single time you open up your canvas, because your canvas will essentially just read from that serialization and it will just display all of those elements that are on your slide based on the text that it reads from your serialization field. And so in order to save the serialization, we're just going to type in the word save under our workflow actions here. And we're going to select the option to save as a serialization for the canvas on our page. And now it's going to automatically run a workflow step that will save that serialization. And then once the serialization has been saved, I'd like to save a version of this particular slide that we're working on as a PNG that can then be downloaded if a user would like to do so. And so I'm going to add an additional step within our workflow here, and I'm going to type in the word save again. And now I'm going to select the first option here, which is save as PNG to URL. So it's just going to save a PNG version of your current slide into a readable URL file that you can reference at the point that you'd like to actually download that PNG. And so I'm going to select this option here, and it's at this step that we can customize the name of that file once it is downloaded at a later point. So for our PNG file name here, what I'm going to do is actually make this the name of our presentation that we're working on. So I'm going to insert dynamic data here, and I'll display the current page presentation, its name. And now one thing I would just like to point out is that although I'm adding these two workflow steps into the same overall workflow, you should just note that because the serialization is saving quite a long string of text of all the coordinates of elements on your slide, it can sometimes take a little bit longer to save than the actual PNG file to your URL. And so if you really wanted to optimize the user experience within your application, what you could do is actually break these two workflow steps into separate workflows. So that way the second step of your workflow isn't relying on the first one to complete before it runs. Instead, you could just create a different version of your save here that saves just the serialization, and then another that saves the PNG to your URL. But for the sake of my tutorial today, I'm just going to add both of these within the same workflow, just because it's a little bit easier to follow. And now from here, once we've finished building out this step of our workflow, there's another set of actions that we'll need to run within our workflow editor. And that is that I would like to extract the data that has been created within these two steps. So at this point in time, we have saved a serialization to our canvas. But what I'll need to do is store a version of that serialization text into my database, so that way I can reference it every single time a user would like to load the serialization of a new slide. And so what I'm going to do is create a new workflow that runs every single time we save the serialization and the PNG source. But before I do that, because I'm building out a series of workflows here that are going to be used for saving and downloading the slides within our application, I just like to color code these so that way I can tell where they sit within my overall workflow editor. In this case, I'm just going to make these events purple. And so now I can create a brand new workflow from scratch here. And if you head to your elements actions here, you'll see a bunch of different triggers you can select from that relate to the Fabric.JS plugin. And in this case, I'm going to select from this option here, which triggers every single time the canvas on the page has generated a save image URL, which, if you remember, is the very last step within our first workflow here. So once both of these workflow actions run, it's going to trigger this new workflow. Before we build out this workflow, I'm going to update the color of this to be purple, so that way I can tell it apart from the rest of my workflows here. And the first thing I'd like to do within my workflow here is make changes to the current slide within my database. So I'm going to head to my data tab here. I'll select to make changes to a thing. And the thing I would like to change is the slide that's currently being displayed and stored in our custom state on the page. So I'm going to reference our presentation page, its current slide custom state, and then within this slide, I would like to update, first of all, the serialization field. And I would like this to equal the value of the serialization that's just been stored within the canvas itself through our previous workflow. So I'll be selecting from the this main canvas, its serialization. So I'm just going to type that in and I'll save its serialization here. And then the only other field I would like to change is just going to be the slide image for this canvas. And so if you remember, the slide image is almost just like the thumbnail preview image we'll be saving for each individual slide. And the reason this is helpful is because, of course, on our home page, when a user selects which presentation they would like to open, it'd be nice to show them a thumbnail image that they're familiar with for this particular slide. So I'm going to update the slide image here to equal the value of this canvas on our page, its PNG URL. So I'm just going to type in the word PNG, and I'm going to select this canvas slide's drawing PNG URL, which of course is the URL we had generated within our first workflow step here. And then from here, the very last thing I'd like to add within this workflow is that I just want to display a success alert message to the end user, just letting them know that we have in fact successfully saved all of their serialization as well as the PNG URL for their presentation. And so I'm going to need to just create that alert first. I'm going to jump to my design tab here. I'm going to head to my alerts. I'll add this anywhere on my page. And I'm just going to add in the words presentation saved. I would also like to position this at the top of my page. And I'm going to want this alert to extend across the full width of my page. So I'll head to my layout tab here. I will unselect that this is fixed width. And I'll just set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width to be infinite. So that way it's just going to take up as much space as it possibly can within the user's browser. I'm then going to jump back into my workflow editor here, and then I'm going to display that alert message. So I'll head to my element actions here. I'm going to choose to show an alert message. And the alert message I'd like to display is, of course, the only alert message on our page here, which is the one we've just added. And now that is how we can build out an experience to save each individual slide within our database. But while we're here, we may as well finish off the very last step within our tutorial, which is of course creating a way to now download the current slide as a PNG file. And so in order to do this, what we're going to do is jump over into our design tab here. I'm just going to hide my alert message here, And if you remember, my focus group is currently being displayed here up in my top left-hand corner. Although when we actually preview our application, it's going to be fixated to our file menu here. And what I'd like to do is now just create a workflow when our download text is clicked. So I'm going to start a new workflow here. Because this workflow references something to do with saving or downloading our actual canvas, I'm going to update the color of this to be purple, just so once again I can differentiate it from the rest of the workflows on this page. And then building out the ability to actually download this canvas slide is very straightforward. We're just going to add a step within our workflow. We're going to type in the word download, and then we're going to select this option here to download a canvas. And the only thing you'll need to change is just the name that you would like to give to this file. In this case, I'm going to want this to be the name of my presentation. So I'm going to insert dynamic data, and I will set that the file name should be the current page presentation, its name. And that's actually the very last core feature I'd like to add within our build today. Before I show you a quick preview though, there is just one small, very last workflow step I'd just like to add into my overall product. And that is just a way to load the serialization of a slide when it's selected from our slide preview menu here. And so if you remember, when we save a slide, we're saving the total serialization for that particular canvas. So essentially just where all of the text and elements will lie on it. But then of course, when we load a slide within our application, we're going to need a way to also load the serialization. So that way the slide can look exactly the same as it was when it was first saved. And if we were to select on our image within our repeating group here, that when clicked updates the slide that's displayed in our canvas, what you'll remember is we had created a workflow step that just updates the custom state to display the slide that is clicked within that particular repeating group. There is just one last thing I'd like to add into that workflow, and that is the ability to just load the serialization of that slide. So I'm going to add an additional step here. I'm going to type in the word serialization. I will select to load the serialization of a canvas. And then for the actual serialization I would like to load, I want to insert dynamic data, and I'd like to load the current cell slide, its serialization data field. And then I'm just going to move this step in our workflow to be the very first step, just because I would actually like to load that serialization before I have it then switch over and display within the canvas that's on our page. And I'd also just like to point out that we'll need to duplicate this specific workflow action within our workflow that's triggered every single time the page is loaded. So if you remember, when the page was loaded, we were setting the custom state of the slide to display to be the very first item where the slide's original presentation equaled the same value as the current page presentation. So by default, that slide is being loaded, but of course, I'd also like to load the serialization of that slide. So I'm going to add an additional step here. I'm going to once again type in the word serialization. I'll select to load the serialization of a canvas. Only this time for our canvas, we're going to need to perform a similar search to when we had set the custom state within the first step here. So for our serialization, I'd like to insert dynamic data. I will perform a search for all of the slides in our database where the original presentation equals the same value as the current presentation. And in this case, I'd want to load the very first slide. So I'll be selecting from the first item in our database, and I'll be loading its serialization. And similar to the workflow I just shown you before, I'm just going to restructure these steps here. So I'm going to set the serialization event to be the first step, and then I'm going to follow that by the step that loads the custom state on our page. And now that is the very last workflow that I needed to add into our build in order to make it complete today. Let's jump on over into a preview of our application, and we can see how both the saving and download features behave. Over in a preview of my application, I've just created a brand new presentation as well as a slide within it. And at this point in time, I have not yet saved my presentation, which as you'll see, of course, I don't have a thumbnail preview of this slide yet within my repeating group on the left here. If I would like to save my presentation, I can head to my file drop-down menu here. I will click that I'd like to save this. That series of workflows would run, and it would not only display our alert message, but as you can see, because we've now saved a slide preview image, that is now being shown within our repeating group on the left. And of course, if I would also like to download this presentation slide, I could click our download button. That workflow would run, and it would now save a PNG version of this slide within our local device, which, as you can see, has just been displayed on my screen here. And of course, the file name of this particular image is going to be the overall name of our presentation. And just like that, that's everything that I actually wanted to cover with not only this section of our tutorial, but the overall build for our Google Slides clone today. So what I'm going to do is just jump back into my Notion checklist here and tick off that we've finished building out the features to not only save a slide within our overall presentation, but also the ability to download that slide as a PNG file. And just like that, we've finished the build for our Google Slides MVP today. As you can see, it's never been easier to bring your product to life using a combination of Bubble's no-code tool and the Fabric.JS plugin by Techblocks. If you were interested in adding some of the additional features that I covered, or would even like any additional guidance when using the Fabric.JS plugin, I'd recommend checking out the Techblocks documentation page, as well as their demo editor. These are really good resources in terms of the depth that they provide, and it just helps simplify the whole process of getting the most out of the plugin. I relied quite heavily on them when I was creating this tutorial, as it taught me everything I needed to know about building my Google Slides product. In the meantime though, if you enjoyed this tutorial and would like to see any additional Bubble resources, be sure to hit that subscribe button below so you can be the first to know when I publish new Bubble content on my channel. Until next time though, I wish you all the best on your own no-code journey.